It's a pleasure to have fellow podcaster Cameron Borg on the Sowing Prosperity platform to share his experience. And Cameron is a wealth of knowledge as we dive into what's really going on with cancer. His way of viewing it is super unique, and I'm having a hard time poking any holes in that. Take a deep dive into deuterium and how he views it, and the absolute incredible guests that he's had on the Ricky Flo podcast. Cameron, thank you so much for joining, brother. Definitely a huge fan of your work. You've done an amazing job with your podcast. I came across you from a mutual friend, Max Gullhane. You being an Australian, I just love kind of the little bit different view that y'all have. So if you will, just give us a little bit of introduction and how you got into podcasting, and then we'll take a little bit of a deep dive in some of these specific topics.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk with people who are interested in the kinds of things that I'm interested in. So I guess I started with an interest in nutrition, and from there I began to learn a little bit more about the things that make nutrition make sense. So I became very interested in things like light exposure, the impact of man-made electromagnetic fields, and how they impact the story that we tell about nutrition. And I found those stories to be much more intriguing and much more powerful than the story about, should I eat meat or should I not eat meat, or how many antioxidants am I having? Those ideas became very boring and dull to me when I started to look into even things like earthing were extremely interesting to me, because they sort of represent larger larger changes in our environment over the last 100 or so years. Certainly much larger than the food system. In my opinion, there's sort of this difference. Food has changed in some sense quantitatively, so the amount of different things we're getting from the food has shifted. But with something like synthetic chemical exposure or man-made electromagnetic fields, we're looking at exposures that are qualitatively different. So these are things that we'd never experienced before in our entire evolutionary history, and then all of a sudden we have these types of exposures. So to me, my primary interest is these exposures that are qualitative changes, things that we weren't exposed to before that now we are to quite a large extent. And I think a lot of the answers to the questions surrounding the chronic disease epidemics lie in the changes that have been the biggest over the last 100 years. And certainly diet and nutrition and agriculture are very important parts of that. But to me, we really have to start at the tippy top, the things that have changed the most. And I think that's just, to me, that's a logical place to start, but it doesn't seem to be the spot where most people start. So that's sort of been the way that I'm navigating the health space, and sort of using that as my North Star to help guide me through and help me figure out where I need to direct my attention.
I think that the nutrition front is the easiest. It's almost that, gateway into this world, right? And so when my son was diagnosed with cancer, it was the very first thing that I paid attention to, right? Like it was like, well, what's he supposed to be eating? What's he not supposed to be eating? And then, getting the standard answers of it doesn't really matter. Just don't lose weight. It didn't feel right. And so as I dove in for, self-discovery, self-knowledge, I read the China study, and that scared me. And then I was like, oh my God, meat causes cancer and all this. And so just kept going on. I think it was, Stephen Gundry's book, The Plant Paradox, started making me question that narrative. And then that led me to Ken Berry. And then Ken just, started saying things that were so far from what I believed to be true that it just kind of shut me down. And so I say all that to say the more you go down this path and don't stop at, well, the keto diet's the best diet, that's all we should be doing, or carnivore or vegan or whatever it is, and you just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think it was probably Max's work that first got me into that circadian aspect, and then the light impact. And we all know Jack Cruz and his mission and what he's done, but let's go into a little bit of this cancer specific discussion with what you're doing, because I mean you're well into, how many podcasts have you done with just absolute experts?
About 50 through 52 at the moment.
52. And that's everything from doctors and PhD astrophysicists. I mean, just on and on and on how you've done. So, I've had the privilege to getting to know a lot of these same people, right? From, Laszlo or Scott Zimmerman. And what has been shocking is that their work makes so much sense, but it's not popular, or it's hard to grasp that it matters, right? So if you will, let's go into a little bit of more of the fundamental aspects that are, cancer and light and deuterium, just how you're seeing those pieces come together.
I guess I'll probably start by framing what I think cancer is. It's a very complex disease in that we don't really understand it. And I think the best way to look at cancer, is sort of going back to the genesis of the multicellular organism. So for the longest time, for over 2 billion years, the Earth was basically dominated by single-celled organisms, bacteria, and they more or less look the same today as they did 4 billion years ago, which is quite remarkable. To think that there was something basically preventing them, or they had reached, the peak of their efficiency and they didn't need to get any better at doing anything specifically. And then, about 2 billion years ago, we see the start of a new type of cell. And this started with an endosymbiotic event where, by the best account we have at the moment, an archaea, so a single-celled organism, basically swallowed a bacteria. And originally, their relationship was probably parasitic, probably wasn't very nice, but then eventually became sort of this mutualistic relationship. And from there, that allowed this type of cell to basically detach and become liberated. Because it could make energy much more efficiently. And that was essentially the first eukaryotic cell, which allowed for multicellular organisms to sort of take over. And when you're part of a multicellular organism, you no longer play by the same rules as a single-celled organism. A single-celled organism basically cares about its own movements and its own progeny. So what it likes to do is move around to find the best place to be and reproduce as much as possible. That's essentially what a unicellular organism is focused on. Multicellular organisms, they live in a community of cells. So those rules have to change, because if you just prioritize yourself, you can sacrifice the whole. So they developed these very complex relationships between the cells that made up the whole organism. And I think what we're seeing in cancer is a breakdown of the communication between the cells that make up the whole. So I think essentially cancer starts with a cell that no longer realizes that it's surrounded by cells that make up the whole, or a whole organism. And when that communication line is cut, the cell essentially has to revert back to a sort of amoeba-like state where it thinks it's the only cell. So what is a unicellular organism focused on? It's focused on movement, taxis, so finding nutrients, finding the best, nice, warm, wet, nutrient-rich place to be. and it focuses on reproduction. It focuses on cell division because that's what you do when you're a unicellular organism. That's what makes sense. And we have very good evidence that a hallmark of cancer is a drop in charge in the cell. It's very well documented that cancer cells don't have a strong electric charge. And what happens when the charge goes down? It seems that the communication networks between the cells, these gap junctions, they also break down. And once those gap junctions are broken, that is essentially when the cell becomes an amoeba again. So no way to communicate with the cells around. And for all it knows, it's the last cell in the body left. And all it is focused on doing is growing and dividing as much as possible. And what tumor genes, oncogenes, do is they lower the charge in the cell. They lead to the severing of the gap junctions. So there's a brilliant study several years ago by Mike Levin and one of his PhD students, and they inserted in tadpoles these very nasty oncogenes that cause tumor growth. What are they called? KRAS mutations. And KRAS mutations are often used in cancer research because they cause very aggressive tumors. And they put a KRAS mutation in a tadpole, and of course it grew a tumor. But then they put a KRAS mutation, but also put in an ion channel that prevented the cells from losing their charge. They maintained a very high electric negative charge in the cell, and they didn't get tumors at all. So we start to understand that the genes are actually contributing to the electrical nature of the cell. And when that electrical nature changes to a sufficient degree, it really breaks down the way that the cell can communicate with the cells around it. So it basically changes the cell's worldview. It changes what it perceives as its environment. So there are people out there who will suggest that in this way, cancer is not a disease. It just happens to be what that group of cells thinks they need to do at that specific time. And I don't want to make it sound as simple as that. There's certainly so many other things playing into this. But I think essentially what cancer is cells that no longer realize they are part of a whole. Their communication networks have been broken down. And we know all sorts of things that cause those communication networks to break down. Synthetic chemicals are a great example. Anything that's known to cause cancer is likely doing it through a similar mechanism of reducing the net charge within the cell. And again, I don't want to make it sound simple. Not only is it that simple, is it not that simple, but there's all different types of cancers. They grow at different rates. There's a litany of other variables that play a role. But I think if you want to understand cancer, you need to understand how the shift between unicellularity and multicellularity, why that event is so important. I really think that's where the cancer story starts, because it really sets the stage for a disease like that to take hold. I hope that sort of makes sense, but I mentioned Mike Levin. I really think his work is probably the most sensible in this area, because he is very much exploring these ideas in a way as to not alarm too many people in the scientific community, that he's saying genes don't matter. They matter, but not in the sense that most people think. So I feel like Michael Levin's work is probably the closest to getting us to really understand what cancer is. And I think the implications of realizing that cancer is probably related to a loss of communication, you start to realize that the conventional treatments have nothing to do with restoring cellular communication. Absolutely nothing. So how useful can they really be, when perhaps we should be focusing on figuring out how we can reestablish those communication networks? Because once they do, those cells will be told to commit cell death, apoptosis, and they will go about their way as they should normally do when they're part of a whole. So that's really my take on cancer. It's a little bit different than most people's take, but I think that makes sense. I think that's logical to think about. I don't think you would, if you didn't have a scientific background, that story kind of makes sense. Or at least I hope it does anyway.
No, it does. And the talk with, cancer experts on a wide range of experiences, and nobody has a definitive answer on what they believe cancer is, right? It's still so much gray area there. And I think there's a lot that we've got to learn. But I think that what you just laid out in my experience of doing this, it makes the most sense. It really does. But what I think the disconnect is that the way in which cells communicate is not the way that people think happens, right? So let's go into a little bit of that, because you take, say, Roland Van Wyck's work, right, on how light is such an important key. That's big. And when we take into account electro and magnetochemistry, I think that's extremely important. So let's tie in a little bit of that light piece and the deuterium piece for cellular communication.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes back to 1923 with Gerwich's onion root experiment, where he showed that onion tips could stimulate mitosis in other onion tips through suspected ultraviolet spectrum light, which he called mitogenic radiation at the time. And a lot of studies like that have reproduced the exact same results. I wish I could remember his name, but anyway, I can't remember. But he did a study, I think it was last year, very elegant sort of design, same sort of thing, except he used mitochondria in test tubes, two test tubes right next to each other, a third one separated by something that prevented light from getting through. And when the mitochondria were undergoing mitochondrial biogenesis, in the middle tube, the one that was able to receive the light from that also did. The one that had the light cut off from it did not. So it's just another really good example showing how powerful light is in intracellular communication. And we have no reason to believe that light doesn't play an enormous role in not only the communication between mitochondria within the cells, but also between the cells themselves. Light is being emitted very, very at very high levels, particularly with relation to reactive oxygen species. So when they're generated, there's effects where the reactive oxygens respond, and the electrons jump states, and then they essentially emit a biophoton. It's not as simple as that, but essentially that's where it's suspected the bulk of biophotons are coming from reactive oxygen species. And again, these photons are being acting as signal molecules, signaling devices, essentially. And what the impact of that is not easy to understand, but because it's probably something that's been going on for an extremely long time, we can probably assume that they're highly conserved and responsible in a lot of different processes. So biophotons are extremely interesting. Roland Van Wyck's work is, I think, extremely important, and I think he's working predominantly now on trying to use biophotons to explain Chinese medicine and the medicine of the East, because their philosophy is reflected exactly in what is being found in the biophoton research. So people who are ill, for instance, will exhibit unilateral or what do they call it? It's not symmetrical, non-symmetrical release of biophoton. So their left hand and their right hand won't be releasing the same amount. And this is exactly what was said from Eastern philosophy, and ideas of chakras and using acupuncture to unblock, energy blockages in the body. We're seeing the exact same ideas come out in the biophoton research. So that type of work is really bridging the gap between Eastern medical philosophy and what we're discovering now in the most cutting edge Western medicine, which is looking at biophoton emission. But again, light is a very important cellular communicator, and when those gap junctions break down, the gap junctions use light to communicate. If you were nature, you'd want to use light because it's basically the fastest thing you can use to communicate, which is very useful. And when you're looking at the activities within the cell, you're moving lots of charges around, specifically in the mitochondria, and they're generating very powerful fields. And there are really fantastic graphics shown by Doug Wallace, showing the cristae alignment in mitochondria that aren't touching, but their fields overlap. So the cristae sort of align. And these fields probably extend far beyond the cells themselves. So, you can, I think there's a technology in the US Army, I think it's the Army or the Navy, where they can detect heartbeats from 20 feet away based on the sinus rhythm, and they're able to pick it up that far away. So the fields of the body extend a really long way. And of course, we're made up of cells, and all the cells have their own fields, and they're all sort of within a unified field. When we're just walking around, we have a field, and you can pick that up with electroencephalogram. You can pick that up when you have your sinus rhythm measured on an ECG. But every single cell in your whole body has its own field, and these overlap. And again, they most likely used to convey information. And when those fields are interrupted by any means, the communication is broken. It's like trying to watch a movie, except the picture's all messed up. You don't really understand what's going on if the picture's all messed up. And what you want in the fields is complete coherence, because then you can watch the movie crystal clear. But when you lose that coherence in the picture, the story that's playing is a bit lost on you. And you mentioned deuterium as well. It's a very interesting story with how it relates to cancer. I'm not really sure we understand. I know Gabor, in his book, sort of paints this story about the sodium hydrogen syn-porter, and when cells start to divide, the deuterium to hydrogen ratio in the cytoplasm increases, which is essentially what is needed to initiate cell division. So you actually need that rise in cytoplasmic deuterium to hydrogen ratio in order to initiate mitosis. So if that is limiting, obviously cells struggle to divide, which is why deuterium is important. You actually need it to a certain degree, because it plays, just as vital a role as hydrogen. But what happens is, when you consume too much deuterium to hydrogen based on the environment that you're in, what it does is it basically changes the kinetics throughout the whole body. So deuterium is twice as heavy as hydrogen. The bond is twice as strong. Obviously, anything with those deuteriums in the compound itself are going to be acted on very differently in enzymes. The way that they act in proteins and whatever else they might be used in is quite different. And we don't know what the impact of that could be, but I suspect because deuterium impacts the way water is polarized by electric fields, it's also impacting communication, because water being polarized is actually a great way to create coherence in the cell, because you can align all of the dipoles. Whereas if you have water with deuterium in it, so DHO rather than H2O, the way that lattice is made, those coherent domains, there's lots of different phrases that get used. Gerald Pollack's fond of exclusion zone, structured water, coherent domains. They're all almost talking about the same thing, but I like the term coherent domains because in this case, we're talking about deuterium decreasing the capacity for coherence in that water. But again, we don't really understand the implications of excess deuterium or even using deuterium depletion as a protocol in cancer. We don't really know what's going on, but I suspect it has something to do with the ability for the body to use quantum coherence in the cell. It's easier to maintain coherence in certain situations depending on the type of chemicals, the chemical makeup. Again, deuterium depletion seems to be really helpful in cancer, though. And why that is, it's not exactly known, but it seems to be. I would posit that most people in the population would have an excess of deuterium, just because it's very easy to overconsume deuterium-rich foods, particularly out of scope with your environment. It's very, very simple. I mean, just having a teaspoon of sugar in your coffee, for instance, gives you a load of deuterium that would be extraordinarily difficult to do in natural circumstances. And then, you have to offset that somehow. So I suspect most people would probably do quite well with some sort of deuterium depletion protocol, whether that's just consuming foods that are local to their environment to give their body the right ratio over an extended period of time. But yeah, the deuterium depletion does seem to be quite helpful in cancer. Not all cancers, but I think the vast majority respond quite well. It's not a cure-all, and I don't think anyone would say that, but it's certainly a useful tool in the toolkit. So I know there's sort of three quite broad topics, but they all link together in one way or another.
Yeah, I think another piece of the deuterium that we just need to understand more is, for lack of a better term, in the cytoplasm, deuterium being squeezed produces light, right? It produces UV light. And I think that, as we know, with the cytochromes and mitosis, it's going to throw it off substantially. And so when you look at, for example, a deuterium lamp, right? I went down this rabbit trail because that's the only thing that we have, say, in physics to look at how deuterium produces light. And that has been fascinating to me. And I have really not heard anybody in the deuterium space talk about that. But that goes back to the coherence that you're talking about in communication. It throws off communication. So is that anything that you're aware of? And if not, what do we do in your estimation to improve that coherence that you're talking about?
So I think the reason you don't really hear many people talking about this sort of squeezing effect is it's not information that's easy to come by. I certainly haven't come across anything that talks about it. I've only heard people talk about it. So, I couldn't say for sure because I don't know. There does seem to be a reason why deuterium is concentrated in the blood. Like on the surface, it seems to be more concentrated on the surface. And it might be that deuterium is there to sort of act as a buffer and help maintain coherence underneath. So you can imagine where there's more deuterium in the environment, like at the equator where you have lots more, fruits and carbohydrates are generally available year round. You have much higher energy photons year round. So there might be something to do with putting deuterium in the serum to help prevent those high energy photons from having too much of a decoherence effect, because a photon could affect a quantum measurement. Presumably, it's changing the environment. It's creating some sort of information gathering system if it interacts with a molecule, for instance. So deuterium might be placed in the blood for that reason, to help offset some of those effects. But yeah, I think the reason you don't really hear many people talk about that is because it really is hardcore physics. And generally, people in this space, for better or for worse, aren't looking into hardcore physics. And that's probably because people like myself don't have the background. I really need to be discussing this with someone who really knows their onions about that kind of thing, which I haven't done yet. So maybe that'll be a project for later. But yeah, it does seem that there are, peculiar situations where deuterium does produce unusual effects. And, really my understanding of how to get your deuterium hydrogen ratio to a level that's appropriate for you is to consume food and water that's available in your locale. So making sure that the foods you're eating are grown as locally as possible, because they are going to, you can't grow, for instance, I'm in Stockholm now, you can't grow a banana here. So that's a pretty damn good signal from nature to say that those foods are basically off limit, because the information that they carry, and in this case we're talking about information in the form of deuterium to hydrogen ratio, is completely unmatched to the day length that I have here, the amount of high energy photons that are available here, the magnetic fields that are available here. So on the equator you have much weaker magnetic fields, whereas the further away from the equator you get much stronger magnetic fields. And all of these things, the way that I look at it, all of these environmental signals sort of have to be yoked together. And when they are yoked, you can sort of triangulate really well, and your body knows exactly what's going on. It knows time of day, it knows time of year, it knows what to be doing at the right time. It's all about sort of yoking that timing mechanism. If your body knows how to time everything, it can take care of itself. But the problem is the way, and I'm not talking about a circadian clock here, although that's involved, but the way you sort of set that clock is by triangulating all of the environmental signals together. And that's how your body, that again, going back to that, watching the movie, it makes the picture crystal clear when you're exposed to the right magnetic field, the magnetic field that matches the day length that you've got, the temperature that's around, the solar energy that's available to you, and the food that's available to you. All of these signals have to be giving your body the same message. And I think really eating foods out of season or imported foods, or just doing things outside of that are going to mess up the deuterium to hydrogen ratio. And I think it's important to have more deuterium in the body when you're closer to the equator. But in the same way, I think it's important to have much less the further away from the equator you are, which means for me, I'm not allowed to indulge in as many chocolate croissants as I would normally like to, because I know, I'm almost at the 60th north. So it's not a good idea for me to have a lot more deuterium in my body, because it doesn't match all of the other environmental signals that I'm getting here. And I'm working on a more extended post now on what I'm calling the environmental gradients hypothesis, which is all about why I think disease is caused by those signals, all of those environmental signals not being yoked together. So getting all these different bits of information that are all telling your body conflicting things. I think that's really where disease starts. And I think, the deuterium to hydrogen ratio is one of these signals. It's a very important one. But really, everyone's going to have their own need, their own specific requirement for that ratio. And where I am now is going to be, my deuterium levels probably going to need to be a fair bit lower than when I was living in Sydney, because it doesn't match. It wouldn't match, because we have very different environmental exposures here. I hope that sort of makes sense. It's still sort of something I've been musing over and haven't really been able to really nailed down the way I want to tell that story. But yeah, that's the way I see it at the moment.
Yeah. No, I love it. So let's go into that coherence piece. Like what can we do? You've laid out some seasonal local stuff. What do you do? What do you recommend that we create this, improvement in cellular communication?
So coherence is a really tricky thing to talk about because I think most scientists would probably say it's still very much up for debate whether quantum processes even happen in biological systems, let alone talk about how coherence is maintained. So this is a bit of a strange topic in that I think most people would say we're cuckoo crazy for even bringing up this idea. But it seems to me nature would use anything at its disposal to make things efficient, to make things as efficient as possible. And the fact that it has quantum mechanics at its disposal makes me think that, of course, quantum processes are dominating in the body. I mean, everything's made up of protons and electrons. At the core, we're talking about fundamental particles. We're talking about NAD and FADH donating electrons in the mitochondrial respiratory chain. Of course, there are going to be quantum effects going on there, and of course, coherence is going to be an important part in allowing that to happen smoothly. And one of the things I've been looking into recently is how electrons are actually moved through the respiratory chain. And it looks like it's going to be very similar to the quantum model of photosynthesis, where a photon takes every conceivable path to the reaction core in the chlorophyll simultaneously, and then the wave function collapses and it picks the shortest route. So it's maximal efficiency. And I think the same sort of thing is going on in the protein complexes in the mitochondrial respiratory chain. So complex 1 receives an electron from NAD, and it looks like if you look at the structures, the reaction cores, they call it, inside complex 1, they're very, very good distances for quantum tunneling. So this is the ability for an electron to essentially spontaneously go from one place to the next, faster than the speed of light, which sounds crazy. We're talking about something spontaneous. It's because it's quantum. It's because it's not here or there. It's both at the same time, and depending on when coherence is there, and particularly when coherence collapses. So before I go too far, it's not only important that we have coherence, we also need to be able to control decoherence as well, because we need to decohere to make things tangible, to make things classical again, so to speak. So in able to quantum tunnel, you basically need to have coherence and decoherence at the same time, or at least that's my understanding of it. Remember, I'm not a physicist, but it does seem like these fundamental particles are being moved in ways that will relate to quantum mechanics. And like you said, coherence is really important, because if you don't have coherence from the beginning, you can't even begin to talk about quantum effects, because they don't exist. There are very interesting ideas about Froelich condensates, or these states of matter where things sort of vibrate at the same level. I don't know if you've ever seen those videos of people setting like 20 metronomes off at all different times, and then after about 30 seconds, they all start lining up. I like to think of it like that. So in the cell, if things are coherent, they start vibrating and flowing at the same rate. And that basically helps coherence to happen. And I think this is written about in Jim Al-Khalili and John Joe McFadden's book, Life on the Edge. They talk about the lengths in which cells go to actually establish coherent states within the cell. And this probably happens through vibrational energies. And, just as a side point, that's probably how essential oils exert their effect. The aromatic compounds in essential oils they vibrate. I mean, all molecules vibrate to specific frequencies based on their molecular structure. And it's possible that, you're creating either constructive or deconstructive interference with those frequencies, with those vibrations. So it does seem as though the cell is capable of sort of vibrating to, or establishing some sort of frequency to help the cell become coherent. And why wouldn't it develop that? I mean, it seems like a pretty nice thing to be able to do, is to allow quantum processes to happen. And as to how you would help yourself become adequately coherent, that's a bit more of a topic where you have to sort of zoom out. And to me, I mean, logically, it would be living as close to nature as possible, with regard to, your light exposure, your food intake, avoiding any sort of synthetic chemicals that, have the body hasn't been exposed to before, making sure you're sleeping and waking at appropriate times. All of these things are going to help the body understand what's going on, and where you are, and what time of year it is and what to expect. Again, it's all about triangulating those signals, and I imagine that when all those signals are giving your body close to the same message, your body is able to deal with coherence and decoherence the way that it likes to. The problem is, when we start introducing all of these other things, I particularly worry about exposure to EMF, because it seems to me as though that might be capable of causing decoherence, or basically disturbing the way that cells are communicating. Our body's exquisitely sensitive to those types of things. It wouldn't surprise me if they're having, sort of quantum level effects. So, it's just trying to get as close to nature as possible. You really don't want to analyze it too much. You want to just observe nature and see what nature does, and then try and emulate it, because, we're continuous with nature. There's really no separation between the body and the outside world. They both rely on one another. So as to how to allow your body to use quantum processes in the most optimal way, I think it just comes back to obeying the laws of nature, and trying to get in touch with that as much as possible. I wish I could give you a supplement that would do it, but unfortunately that's not really an option. But I'm sure someone will try and sell that supplement at some point in the future.
Yeah, it's definitely coming. So what's next for you? What are you trying to accomplish? Projects you got working on with the podcast, or how are you trying to take that next step in understanding to piece more of this together?
Well, obviously, first of all, it's just reaching out to more people to speak with on the podcast. I think ultimately my goal on the podcast is to do more conversations where I bring two researchers together from disparate fields who peripherally know each other's work but have never spoken in real life. I really think the biggest steps forward, particularly in these fields, are going to happen through interdisciplinarity. We really need to get guys like Gerald Pollack and Mike Levin and Nick Lane and Jim Al-Khalili and just put them in a room and say, just talk, please, like tell each other your ideas and tell each other about your work, because we're never going to move forward if everyone's just staying siloed, if the biologists only talk to biologists, if the physicists only talk to physicists. It's funny, you speak about me having Bob Fosbury on the podcast, who's an astrophysicist. Him and Glenn Jeffrey figured out how reindeers don't get snowblind. And that would have never happened if an astrophysicist didn't walk into the ophthalmology lab and say, oh, you're looking at the problem all wrong. This is obvious stuff for an astrophysicist, but a biologist would never understand it. And together they figured out how a freaking reindeer eye works, which would have never happened if just biologists worked on this problem. You need to bring in people from all different fields and have them talk. And I really think the power of podcasts is being able to do that. I'm just a lay person, but if I can get these people in the room together and force them to have a conversation for my benefit, I think it's really possible to start fruitful collaborations that come up with new and revolutionary ideas. So that's really the goal with the podcast, is not only to share information to people who might be interested in hearing it, but it's also to try and break the shackles of the life of a researcher is answering emails and applying for grants, and really what it should be is speaking to people from different disciplines and saying, here's what I'm working on, what are you working on? And then trying to see where the through line is, because that never happens in science. It's just really, it's really rare, but it should be something we strive for. And then, I'm trying to write more. It's been quite nice being able to write some longer format articles on Substack, and just try and get my ideas down on paper, because it helps me not only communicate my ideas, but also sort of flesh out things that I've been thinking about, because I often I don't want to give my opinions when I'm talking to someone on a podcast, because when I have someone on, it's their time. I want to hear what they have to say. But the Substack is really a place where I'm allowed to say what I think and give reasons why. So that's been really exciting, being able to put those ideas down. And like I said before, I'm working on that environmental gradients hypothesis, which is, Substack's where that's going to end up as well. So, and hopefully eventually in the next couple of years, write a book for the layperson. I think books are a really powerful tool to get information across. So, aside from that, it's doing stuff like this. All I really want is to reach, if I can reach one person who's going to sort of shift the way that they view health in a more logical way. That's all that I need, because the butterfly effect of that is enormous, especially if young mothers are listening. They're the ones that are going to be able to change the world the most. So that's really the goal for me at the moment, with regard to where things are going, and really hope I'm able to get some amazing researchers and put them in a room together and say, tell each other what you're working on, figure something out.
You're doing a great job, brother. You're breaking things down and getting some really, really fascinating people together. And so, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to visit and share your experience. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know this group, kind of our generation, that are questioning everything, but not just questioning it, trying to package it to be able to share, right? And there's a lot of us, and that's really, really exciting for the future. And so I think you're spot on again with the interdisciplinary aspects and bringing it together. That's massive. That's crucial. And so, man, thank you. Thank you so much. Give us where we can follow along and learn more about what work you're doing.
Yeah, so my podcast is the Richie Flow Nutrition Podcast. I have a website with the same name, Richie Flow Nutrition. I'm most active on Instagram. I'll post all the podcasts and Substack articles on Twitter as well. And then Substack, if you really want to keep up with the sort of ideas that I'm putting out, Substack's the place to be. If you want to support my podcast, Substack's the place to be. I really just want to make it a place where the information is all together. It's all, cross-referenced, so it creates one sort of coherent story. If you're interested, the podcast is probably a good place to start, though.
Love it. Love it. Keep up the amazing work, my friend.
Thank you so much for giving me some time to share my views. I really, really appreciate the invitation. It's been awesome.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.